these movements of protest and uprisings, I think, are historically important. I call them the most important moment in the modern Arab world since the 1920s to today. And the reason I say that is because I've lived through the last 55 years of the Arab world as a writer, reporter, so I've watched a lot of it. And the reason I say that is because this is the first time, I believe, that people across the entire region, for very similar reasons, have risen up in a protest movement because they're all suffering the same pains of denied citizenship, bad living conditions, no hope, no power. And this is a form of, they're trying to be self-determinant. They're trying to shape their government systems, shape their national values, shape their government policies. And so I think this is a historic moment, which is an antidote to the colonial period, which more or less shaped the countries, put people in power, and kept some behind-the-scenes control of policies. That's how I see it, basically.
You know, the mantra of the revolution, if you will, was freedom, justice, bread, and and dignity, social justice. And we tend to see that it was a spontaneous movement, but in many ways it wasn't. You know, in your writing, you talk about how this is coming from a long legacy, and we treat it, even as social scientists, that it happened in a moment and we might have even missed it. But I'm wondering how you see that it's tied to a deeper history, but this moment was, you know, ecumenical in nature. Everyone came to the squares.
I think what we've seen in the last decade is a cumulative culmination of the last 50 or 60 years. It's really after the 1970s that things started to get bad in the Arab world. From the 20s to the mid-70s, late 70s, most people's lives were improving. But after that, things started to deteriorate for various reasons. Corruptions, military control, population growth was faster than economic growth. And so what we have now is a accumulation of pain going back many decades, where short, smaller protests in previous years never really achieved much. And therefore people have given up and they said, we're going to go for the whole thing. We want the whole government system removed, replace it with something new. So there is a link between previous protests, previous moments of discontent, and the current explosion. One of the things that's important to try to do, I believe, and I've watched this from the ground in the Arab region, is to try to understand the various external forces at work. You do have the traditional colonial powers from the West. You now have the Russians in a big way, the Turks, the Iranians, and you have the Arab new powers or would-be powers, the Saudis, the Emiratis. Other people are trying to influence things. But American foreign policy in particular, and British, I would say, going back historically, and the French a little bit, but the American foreign policy in recent years, you know, with their, whatever it is, 45 military bases around the region, the support of autocratic regimes, the total support of what Israel does, regardless of Palestinian or Arab rights, all of these things do have an impact. And you see it when you see polling evidence across the Arab region. Majorities of people say that Israel and the US are our biggest threats. And so, and people say we are willing to have peace with Israel only when it lets a Palestinian state exist. So the link between American foreign policy, other foreign colonial policies, the sentiments of people, and their anger at what's going on, that link is very clear in my view.
What about the role of US role in this during the Arab Spring? I mean, we heard, you know, this kind of signaling game from the Obama administration to not just the Egyptian regime, for example, but also to the Egyptian people. And there's this catalyst of it was US foreign language that catalyzed this moment. And, you know, we saw in 2005 when President Bush and Condoleezza Rice said, we're against the two T's, right? Tyranny and terror. And the tyranny was tyranny in the Middle East. And this is what emboldened, you know, the Kifaya movement, for example. And I'm wondering how you respond to that narrative that there was a Western influence on the kind of coming to the forefront of the uprisings.
I think there's no question that one of the main, if not the single greatest driving force of the uprisings was the manner in which autocratic, sometimes despotic Arab governments mistreated their own people. And the reason they can do that in the eyes of most ordinary Arabs, the reason is that they were supported by foreign powers, often the US, but also other foreign powers as well. And so I think there's a direct relationship between and of course you look at the Arab-Israeli conflict and the impact that has on the region, people's anger, and it's very heavily because of the US total support for Israel and just lip service to Palestinian rights. You have another issue, I think, in the short run, which is when the uprising started in Egypt and Tunisia, I think the United States had no idea what to do. They were totally lost. And they came up with initial ideas first that we support the people, we have them reform, support these leaders, ask them to change. They just didn't know what to do because they'd never faced a dynamic Arab citizenry determined to be self-determinant, to have their own way to create their own governments and policies. The US government never faced that process. They didn't know how to deal with it because they never believed in it. They believed in the autocrats. They initially supported the Israeli government, the Iranian government, the Saudi government, whatever they wanted, for various reasons, the Cold War, oil contracts, and they never ever had the average citizen in their sights. They never thought of what ordinary Arab citizens want. And so when Arab citizens suddenly spoke up with a collective voice, the US was totally befuddled. So you've written a book on the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood has played a very powerful role in some moments of the recent Arab history, and in other moments it's kind of disappeared. Where do you see the Muslim Brotherhood today and the broader Islamist movements with it? I'm not talking of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but I'm talking of mainstream nonviolent Islamist movements like the Muslim Brotherhood. Are they still a force? Are they involved in these uprisings?
You know, historically in the Middle East, especially in a country like Egypt, when we think opposition, we think Muslim Brotherhood. They've been marginalized for so long, but they came into power. And in their coming into power, they were tested with, okay, can you govern? Are you an organization that can only really exist in opposition, or can you exist when you're in power? And while, of course, their power was short-lived, just 11 months, there's a lot of lessons to be learned. And I think the test is really in the future of political Islam. What we did see is that the average Egyptian citizen wanted the decoupling of religion from politics, almost a secularization, if you will. And what the Muslim Brotherhood and other political Islamist organizations are unable to do is they speak in the language of democracy is the gateway for them to enter into power. But what happens when you're in power? Can you really govern democratically, or do you have to curtail the religious language? And it became very clear under the Morsi administration that the religious language was actually causing them to lose popularity when they essentially came into governance on their political power. And so I think the future of Islamists or political Islam, if you will, in the region is actually going to be curtailed. The Muslim Brotherhood of today is not the Muslim Brotherhood of 10 years ago, and is definitely not the Muslim Brotherhood of 20 years ago. Today, the top 3 tiers, if you will, are either in prison or in exile. And can they really be an opposition movement in exile? I think any real opposition in the region is going to inherently come from within the country.
Yeah, we also see the roots of this in previous years. I remember when the Muslim Brotherhood won some elections in Jordan, even though they were pretty decent elections. They won 40% of parliament in the 1980s. They had the Speaker of Parliament. They had a bunch of ministers. They were very powerful, and they were totally incompetent. They had no idea how to use that power. So we've seen this over and over again. When Islamist political forces do get power legitimately, they don't know what to do with it. And the other thing that's fascinating, I believe, is polling evidence across the region clearly supports what you just said, which is that the majority of Arabs are religious, whether they're mostly Muslim, some Christians, a couple of Jews here and there, and not many Jewish Arabs left. But the majority are religious. They want religious values to shape their society, but they don't want religious officials to run their government, like in Iran. They clearly want that separation. Right. And this is an important element. And The uprisings, of course, happened, and the Muslim Brothers pretty much stayed out of it. That in the first 2010 to 11, then they rode the wave to the elections. But in the current uprisings, they're just in the background. They're not. They've lost their credibility, like you said.
I think they lost their legitimacy with the street. You know, historically, I think legitimacy was measured in your proximity to Al-Banna and your years in prison. I think legitimacy now was, were you in Tahrir, and what have you done since? And what they've done since is basically nothing.
Right, and this is an important point for people around the world to understand, which is that average, ordinary Arab citizens are going to judge their leaders, or they're going to judge anybody, not by what they say, not by the way they express their religion, if they go to the mosque, or if they go to the church, or if they dress in a certain way, or they're going to judge them by their performance in office. That we are a performance-based society in the Arab world. People are eager and anxious to have governments that do well. And that's what they're asking for. That's all they're asking. People are asking for decent governance. They're not asking for revenge. They're not asking for power. They're not asking for wealth. They just want to be treated like normal human beings. The Muslim Brothers couldn't do it. Qaeda, ISIS couldn't do it. Even though one of the fascinating things to watch now is how Al-Qaeda is evolving, has been for 10 years, 15 years, in trying to serve people locally, to show that we can make the electricity run, whether it's in Yemen or in Idlib or wherever it may be. And they're trying to be a performance-based movement, but it's not going to work.
So 10 years after the Arab Spring, we talk about Tunisia as being the only success story. Is it an anomaly, or did something else happen here?
Tunisia is a very good and important example of how change might or might not happen. We know very clearly now from the work of scholars, many of your colleagues and my friends, and have done a lot of research. So, Tunisia succeeded partly because the regime was so thin. The president just fled in his plane, and he went to where, of course, he went to Saudi Arabia, where a lot of aging tyrants go, unfortunately. But he fled, and therefore there was a vacuum. The army didn't support the state. And the critical thing was that the opposition between the Muslim Brotherhood and Nahda, who had a lot of European experience, and the trade unions, the labor unions, who were well organized, knew what they wanted. And you had a pretty well-educated citizenry with women playing an important role in society. All these factors came together, which allowed them to make a transition, which didn't happen in Syria or Libya or other places where there was uprising. So I think the Tunisian transition to a constitutional process was very impressive. They spent 2.5 years arguing about words in the constitution. It was just really impressive to watch them. I talked to some of their scholars and listened to what they were doing. They wanted a constitution that was credible, that was legitimate in the eyes of its own people. This has never happened in the Arab world. What you had in the Arab world was self-imposed military or civic leaders, wealthy land-owning, political elites, urban elites, who took the Belgian or the Swiss or some other constitution, copied it, and said, here's how we're going to work. Tunisia tried a different approach, which is to consult the people with big amounts of open discussions in public, and then come up with a consensus that the majority supported. And they did. And they did have the transition. They're having a lot of stresses now for various reasons, part of it external interference. But they are, I think, an important lesson. The Sudanese example of the transition is also equally important. So those are the two countries really we need to watch, because they're the only two that are in the process of transitioning, hopefully, to a permanent democracy.
So 10 years after the uprisings, we see that countries like Egypt are much more repressive than they ever have been. We say it's going to be Mubarak 2.0. This is much worse, right? Upwards of 60,000 political prisoners, the shutting down of most media, or it's owned by the intelligence agencies, shutting down of NGOs, quelling all protests. And Syria is a country that's endured 10 years of civil war, and almost 70% of the population is either refugees or internally displaced. So how do we look at these two countries 10 years later and explain the increased repression?
It's very simple. These are family-run military regimes that don't know any other way to govern. They got through the last 40, 50 years, 60 years because they had a lot of foreign support. The needs of their populations were limited. They could handle them. But once we got into the period after, say, 1990, 1995, it was impossible for them to maintain that kind of government-funded economic growth with their crony capitalist friends. They just couldn't do it. And so repression was their only response. They just knew no other way to do this. Even when they liberalized a little bit here or there, and Syria in the 1980s a little bit, and the Egyptians a little bit after Sadat, they opened up the economy. But that was essentially to enrich their crony capitalist friends more than anything else. It cemented the regime. It didn't really benefit the majority of citizens. And when the pressure really came, they just knew no other response than to hit them militarily, which works for a while, but it cannot be a long-term policy, I don't think.
So when we talk about politics, usually there's winners and losers. And it seemed to be at one point that if the Arab Spring indeed was going to be successful and that people were going to have their needs met and their voices heard, that there were going to be losers in the international world stage within the Middle East and the region. And it seemed at one point that countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE saw this threat of this democracy movement. And so I'm wondering if you can speak to the role of the UAE and Saudi Arabia during the Arab Spring and today.
I think in retrospect, it's pretty clear that the Saudis and the Emiratis really panicked. They freaked out. After the initial uprising and then the election of the Morsi government in Egypt, and they saw other movements around the region, they really got scared because they knew they could not transform their own systems into more democratic systems, and they knew that they had no other option than to use the only tool they had, which was a lot of money. And they built up their power. So to be fair to them, the Emiratis and Saudis signaled early after the uprisings that they were going to take care of their own concerns. They were going to protect themselves. They're not helpless against regional trends, because it wasn't just the uprisings and the elections, democratic elections of Islamist governments. It was also that the West and the US was talking to Iran. There was talk of a shift to Asia, and the Middle East is going to be left behind. Asia is what's going to matter. So they got really scared. They said, hey, what about us? Don't we matter anymore? The reality is that no, they don't matter anymore. They have power, they have energy power, they have military forces, but they don't know how to use them very well. If you look at what they've done in Yemen years ago, if you look at what they've done in Yemen now, they tried to destabilize countries or support autocratic regimes to keep away the movements for democratic change. As the uprising started, they tried to interfere in Tunisia. They recently tried to interfere in Sudan. They tried to interfere in Lebanon. They tried to boycott Qatar. They started the war in Yemen. Everything they've done has failed. So they're not only adventurous and reckless and dangerous, they're also quite incompetent at using their power for foreign policy objectives. What they do in their own country, repressing their own people, whatever, that's their business. I mean, we can criticize it, but that's not the main point. The main point is when they start using their power around the region to prevent democratic expressions of transition to self-determinant states, then it becomes all of our business. And they're still trying to do this. They're trying to develop relationships in the Horn of Africa with various governments and regimes and try to build military bases. And so they are in a fast-paced race against what they see as an inevitable trend of more populist, democratic, nationalist kind of governments. And of course, one of the manifestations of this is their movement towards Israel. The Emiratis openly, the Saudis quietly, because they see Israel as their ultimate protector now, not so much the US, maybe, we don't know. They haven't explained this to us very much. But it raises an important point again, which comes up over and over in the region, which is a lot of the governments do not rely on their own people, neither for their own validation nor for their real sovereignty and identity. They rely on foreign powers. Foreign powers created them, foreign powers sustain them, protect them, fund them, and shield them from criticism from abroad. And this is now still going on, and other countries are similarly trying to interfere in other people's affairs. The Egyptians got involved in Libya. The Qataris occasionally do something here and there, low intensity, in Syria and places. But the Emiratis and the Saudis are the real sort of culprits in this process, and they really represent the dangerous force of a resurgent authoritarian spirit in the region linked to enormous military and economic power that they have no idea how to use, but they use it anyway. So we'll see. We're starting to see reactions against them in the Western countries. In the US, you see it in the Senate, a little bit in the White House. In Europe, you see it. People are saying, look, we can't keep selling these people all these arms and helping them in the war in Yemen. This is not morally sustainable. We did it, but we're going to stop it now, maybe. So you can see a shift in how some Western countries are reacting, and certainly in public opinion, you see it a lot.